Hello, my name is Owen, and today I'm going to be showing you exposure and how it works. Exposure includes shutter speed, aperture, and ISO, but first I'll talk about shutter speed. Shutter speed is defined as the length of time light is allowed to fall on the sensor of the camera, or in simplest terms, the length of time the shutter is open. Shutter speed is measured by the amount number per second, so 1 of 80 means that the photo will be taken at 1/80th of a second, and 2 means that the photo will be taken in 2 seconds. Taking a photo of a moving object can change the way your photograph looks. For example, if I took a photograph of a moving vehicle at 1/1000th of a second, the vehicle will create a freeze motion. If I took a photograph of another moving vehicle, but at 1/50th of a second, the vehicle will create a blur motion. If you're trying to take a photograph with no blur effect and don't own a tripod or don't have a tripod on you when taking a photograph, I would recommend setting the shutter speed at 1/60th of a second or higher depending on if your hands are shakier than most people. Next up will be aperture. Aperture is defined as the size of the opening in the lens when taking a photo. Aperture is measured by aperture values, also known as f-stops. So for instance, f-stop 4.5 is considered to be a large aperture because it has a large aperture opening and a small depth of field. F-stop 29 is considered to be a small aperture because it has a small aperture opening and a large depth of field. For example, if I took a photograph of this farmland at an f-stop of 5.6, the aperture will have a wider opening and the photograph will show a smaller depth of field. If I took a photograph of this farmland at an f-stop of 29, the aperture will have a smaller opening and the photograph will show a larger depth of field. The last part of exposure is ISO. ISO is a setting that controls the sensor sensitivity to light. The higher the ISO number, the more sensitive your camera is to light, causing more light to come in your photo. Although having a high ISO might sound great when taking a photo in darker areas, it will however cause your photograph to be grainier. So if you don't want a grainy effect in your photograph, I would suggest lowering the aperture value and shutter speed and keeping the ISO number low as possible. For example, if I took a photograph of this subject with a low ISO, the subject should look perfectly normal. However, if I switch it to a high ISO, the photograph will be very grainy, which is something that most people don't want in their photograph. All three of these settings in photography are connected to what is called exposure. Exposure captures subject detail, captures or eliminates background detail, that will depend on what you want your photograph to look like, creates moods, and overall looks great. Another setting on the camera that is helpful is the exposure meter. The exposure meter helps you show whether your potential photograph might be overexposed or underexposed. If you want your photograph to have an even amount of exposure, make sure to keep the line close to the middle as possible. However, that doesn't mean that all photographs will look good with an even amount of exposure. This is a good example of a photograph with an even amount of exposure because everything that is in this photograph doesn't have any dark or bright areas. This is an underexposed photograph, which causes some areas to be too dark. This is an overexposed photograph, which causes some areas to be too bright. This is a good example of a photograph that doesn't have an even amount of exposure, but still looks visually pleasing because if I did take this photograph with an even amount of exposure, the branches and some parts of the bird would have been darkened, which causes my main subject to be less identifiable. So in order to have my main subject in focus the way I wanted it to, I had to overexpose the photograph just a little. I hope this helped you understand and learn more about exposure specifically, and I hope you enjoyed watching this video as well.